I'll show you how to ferment cucumbers.
The term pickle for many years.
With so many pickle making videos out there, I had to ask myself, why make another one? Growing up, there was always a jar of Sichuan Pao Cai at home, a taste of my parents' hometown. That deep appreciation of food led me into the kitchen. And in the culinary world, few names carry more weight than Noma.
World's best restaurant 2010, 2011, 2012, 2014.
2021
is Noma. Noma. Noma.
Noma.
Once again, Noma.
At Noma, fermentation isn't just a technique, it's a foundation present in every single dish. Their approach is precise, experimental, and science-driven, a stark contrast to the intuitive, time-honored method practiced in Chinese households. That contrast made me curious. So in this video, I'm making Sichuan Pao Cai two ways. One jar follows my grandma's method, passed down through generation. The other uses Noma's way, straight from what many consider the fermentation Bible, the Noma's Guide to Fermentation. How do these two methods compare in practice? And more importantly, do they actually taste different? Instead of just following the recipe, I also wanted to go deeper to understand what's really happening in lacto fermentation. Because once we understand the why, we can really get creative with the how. Let's get started. Good pickles start with the right ingredients. In my grandma's generation, fermentation mostly relied on whatever was local and in season. Today, depending on where you live, that could be a total luxury. But we can still make thoughtful choices from what's accessible. Noma encourages choosing organic to avoid wax coatings and pesticides that can interfere with fermentation. For the batch I'm making, I opted for organic when possible. But that shouldn't be a limitation. Some key ingredients for Sichuan Pao Cai, which I can only find at the Asian market, don't necessarily fall into that category. But without them, my Pao Cai just wouldn't feel complete. Ultimately, fermentation is about working with what you have. Maybe the best approach is to choose thoughtfully and use what's available. For my grandma's method, I'll be using the jars I made in a previous episode. A proper Chinese pickle jar has a water seal, and there is a fun way to test if it works. Fire. Some explanations I've seen online suggest this happens because the oxygen inside is used up, causing the water to be sucked in. But I'm skeptical. Burning paper produces nearly the same amount of carbon dioxide plus H2O, so depending on the state of the water, the total gas volume should remain fairly stable, if not increase. Plus, that doesn't explain the bubbling at the beginning. My theory. If we look at the ideal gas law, the main reason could be temperature change. As the paper burns, it rapidly heats the air, T goes up, and N may increase slightly, causing P to rise. With higher pressure, the air expands and escapes through the water seal, hence the bubbles, and N decreases slightly. But since the seal only lets air out, not in, the moment the flame dies from oxygen depletion, the heat source is gone, and T drops fast, lowering the P. When the internal pressure falls below the external pressure, the water is pushed in. It's all gone. In the unsealed pot, air flows freely through cracks or openings, constantly adjusting N to maintain equilibrium between P inside and outside. That's why you won't see this vacuum effect. It worked! That's my best guess. I have no way to prove it scientifically. What do you think? Anyway, it's a relief to know that my jar will probably work just fine. Now it's time to clean them up before the real work starts. For my grandma's method, she insists on hand washing the jar thoroughly to remove any fat or oil and then air drying it completely before use. With Noma's method, I'm using regular mason jars as they do. The book also elaborates on what they mean by cleaning, sanitizing, and sterilizing. To make a batch of pao cai or most lacto-fermented vegetables, sanitizing is sufficient. Running the jars through a hot cycle in a dishwasher should be more than enough. Next up, the vegetables. The backbone of Sichuan pao cai are probably ginger, chili pepper, and Sichuan peppercorn. When in season, fresh green Sichuan peppercorn is the go-to, but dried versions can be found online. I brought some from China not too long ago, so I'm excited to use them in a brine. Finding exact chili peppers mostly used in Sichuan pao cai can be tricky outside of China. I use Thai chilies and Fresnos as substitutes, which offer similar flavor and are more accessible in the US. It's also highly recommended to add daikon, radish, or carrots in your first batch to help develop the flavor of the brine. Beyond that, you can be creative. Cabbage and long beans are popular choices in Sichuan. Before they can even go into the jar, we need to make sure our ingredients are in top shape. That means sorting through them, checking for firmness, and removing any that have started to go bad before giving them a good wash. Noma's guide recommends rinsing under cold water and avoiding scrubbing to preserve the natural bacteria on the surface. My grandma does the same cleaning process, but always air dries the vegetables afterwards, making sure no untreated water gets introduced into the brine. I trim off the tips of the chili peppers but keep them whole, especially in the first batch, where they serve primarily as seasoning. The goal is to keep them intact long enough to fully release their flavor into the brine. Now that both jars and vegetables are clean and dry, let's talk about the brine. Pao cai in Chinese literally means soaked or brined vegetables. Unlike sauerkraut or kimchi, where fermentation happens in its own juices, pao cai starts submerged in brine, creating the right environment for lactic acid bacteria to thrive. And all you need are two things: water and salt. For my grandma's method, she always boils the water first and lets it cool down to room temp before using it. A habit passed on through generations when water could come from diverse sources like rivers, springs, or wells. Noma, on the other hand, doesn't specify water treatment. However, another fermentation classic recommends avoiding tap water due to chlorine or chloramine, which can interfere with fermentation. To keep things simple and fair, I'll be using bottled water for both methods, boiling and cooling it for my grandma's jar, and using it straight for Noma's. Next, salt. Salt are not created equally, but most salt would get the job done. My grandma prefers using pickling salt, and Noma's guide also calls for non-iodized salt. If you don't have pickling salt at hand, kosher salt or sea salt works just fine. Check the label to avoid anti-kicking agents and iodine when possible. Then comes the million-dollar question.
多少盐？
花椒大蒜，
放多少盐呢？
Unfortunately, Grandma's method is
这10块儿你自己去掌握。这
elusive.
个多也可以多一点，也可以少一点。
自己掌握。我哪么掌握啊？
Meanwhile, Noma's guide takes the opposite approach, breaking it down with baker's percentage. Their fermentation recipes often start at 2% salt. But for this, I'm following their pickled white asparagus brining ratio, 3% salt based on the total weight of water and vegetables. But why does salt percentage matter? Or better yet, why do we even use salt in lacto-fermentation? You often hear that salt preserves food, creates a selective environment for microbes, and slows down fermentation.
But how?
First, when salt dissolves, sodium and chloride ions bind to water molecules, reducing water activity, aka the amount of water available for microbes to function. Second, salt triggers osmosis, pulling water out of the cells, dehydrating them. For some salt-intolerant microbes, these two moves alone could mean the end. And salt isn't done yet. He also messes with enzymes, the cellular catalysts that microbes use to facilitate their metabolism. Or sometimes it just forces microbes to waste energy dealing with sodium ions. Either way, it makes life miserable for anything that can't handle it, but creates the perfect condition for lactic acid bacteria to thrive. But this is nothing personal. Salt is just there, shaping the entire ecosystem. Different microbes have different salt tolerances, even enzymes behave differently at various concentration. And that's why tweaking the salt level could potentially lead to different fermentation outcomes. Now that all our mise en place is ready, it's time to put everything together. I started with Noma's jars, following Noma's guide step by step. First, I placed the jar on a scale and packed it with vegetables. Then, I poured in just enough water to fully submerge them. I took note of the total weight and calculated 3% of that weight for the salt. I poured some water out to dissolve the salt and added the mixture back into the jar. Finally, I weighed the vegetables down using a water-filled Ziploc bag. You may also notice that I removed the rubber band from the lid. This allowed gases produced during early fermentation to escape easily. Next up, Grandma's jar. Her method is a little different. First, I filled the jar about halfway with water. Then, I added salt directly into the jar, stirred to dissolve, and tasted the brine.
It is quite salty. Is it enough? I really have no idea.
I really wish I had her taste buds to tell exactly when it's just right.
I think for the first batch, I would just put a little bit more, just to be safe.
But I did my best.
We'll see.
Next, I added the vegetables, starting with the smaller ones first, so the bigger ones could help weigh them down. I packed in quite a lot, which meant I had to top it off with more salt water to keep everything submerged. Then, Grandma's secret ingredients: a handful of rock sugar and a splash of baijiu. This one, 52% alcohol. Tasty. If you don't have baijiu, spirits like vodka works too. Finally, I followed her last step, covering the jar's mouth with plastic wrap before sealing the lid. Then, I filled the mold with water to create an airtight seal. Aside from Grandma's secret ingredients, they contain mostly the same vegetables, making this the perfect side-by-side comparison in the days ahead. When we submerged the vegetables in brine, we created a salty, low-oxygen environment where most aerobic and salt-sensitive microbes cannot survive. With fewer competitors, microbes that thrive in these conditions, including our main stars, lactic acid bacteria, began to take over and kickstart fermentation. The first thing I noticed: bubbles. At this stage, a heterofermentative lab called Leuconostoc mesenteritis tends to dominate. But what does heterofermentative mean? Labs are classified into two groups based on their fermentation pathways. Homofermentative lab convert sugars almost entirely into lactic acid. Heterofermentative lab produce lactic acid, but also acetic acid, ethanol, and CO2. That CO2 form tiny bubbles and foam, giving the brine a lively look. By day 2 or 3, bubbling intensified, and the initial clear brine turned cloudy, a sign of increased microbial activity. During this stage, the pH dropped from 7.7 to 5.2. In our taste test, the Daikon brine started out just salty. We didn't detect any sourness until day 4.
It's sour.
Where the pH dipped below 5. our perception of sourness isn't linear. The shift from pH 8 to 5 isn't as drastic in taste as pH 5 to 2. In fact, most people don't perceive sourness until the pH hits 4 to 5. When there are other flavors at play,
Still quite salty.
it's even more complicated.
I like there's still a little bit of sweetness to it. You can taste the sweetness of daikon.
Take Coca-Cola for example. Its pH hovers around 2, sometimes even lower than vinegars. Yet it tastes completely different due to all that added sugar. But with Grandma's secret ingredient, Baijiu, Matt immediately noticed something different in smell and taste,
Like this celery, or not celery. Tastes like the.
though he struggled to pinpoint it.
Can't remember.
15 minutes later.
What is this thing called? Twizzlers. You know what Twizzlers are?
No!
Licorice. What herb tastes like licorice?
Fennel seeds.
There we go,
lettuce,
fennel.
And licorice flavor.
Thank you.
This is from the
That's enough.
kitchen.com.
Fennel.
Meanwhile, in the microbial world, unfortunately, Leuconosta couldn't handle its own success. It's not very acid tolerant. As it pumped out acids, it slowly killed itself off. But its work wasn't in vain. It had paved the way for stronger, more acid-tolerant lab strains like Lactobacillus plantarum. This marks the primary fermentation, where the focus shifts to organic acid production rather than gas. So the bubbles and foam die down. Meanwhile, the color transformation is in full swing. Radish and cabbage faded to pale hues. Daikon absorbs the pinkish tint of the brine. Long beans take on a slightly brownish tint. The science behind this? The pigments responsible for the red, purple, and blue hues in purple cabbage and radish skin, anthocyanins, are pH sensitive. They remain purple in neutral pH, turn red in acidic environments, and shift to blue or green above pH 7. So, if you don't have a pH meter, adding anthocyanin-rich ingredients can serve as a natural pH indicator. As for flavor,
It's still pretty salty. There's little sourness to it compared to like the first day where it's basically just salty, nothing else. I feel like the sweetness kind of come forward a little more.
It's much more balanced now.
Yeah.
by day 5, it was much more enjoyable than the initial salty brine.
It's good. Do they sell brine?
However, as pH change slowed,
The same?
subtle shifts in acidity became harder to detect by taste alone. Instead, each jar developed its own unique balance of flavors and aromas.
It's starting to taste distinctly Chinese.
You trained.
That up.
The work is done now.
It tastes like Insap hot pot.
Well, I wish I could taste that.
Maybe it's the peppercorn. Cheers.
Yes. It's the peppercorn.
Fermentation is generally considered complete when the pH stabilizes between 3.4 and 3.6. By this point, the brine cleared up, bubbles disappeared, and the pickles had fully transformed. The result? Preserved vegetables with more complex flavors.
Yeah, I like it.
Pretty mind-blowing.
Lactic acid may be the star here, but fermentation is a wild microbial dance. Different microbes using different fermentation pathways to munch on different sugars and nutrients at different times.
That's why my pickles won't taste exactly the same as yours. Even my next batch won't taste exactly the same as these ones.
Sichuan Pao Cai has an additional layer of complexity thanks to spices like Sichuan peppercorn, chili, and ginger, which creates its signature aroma. The small amount of alcohol not only enhances aromatics, but also has been a traditional way to deal with calmies. That thin layer, white film, sometimes develops with too much oxygen exposure. I experimented with extra jars using different salt concentrations and small procedural changes out of curiosity. While my sample size is too small to draw solid conclusions yet, one interesting takeaway was how salt percentage is calculated. My grandma freestyles her salt measurement. Many pad thai recipes now use percentage-based brine, calculated as salt weight relative to water weight, while Noma's guide factors in both the water and vegetable. Since veggies release moisture over time, this method provides more precision and consistency.
But context matters.
Fermentation in China has a long history. Home cooks didn't have scales hundreds or even thousands of years ago. More importantly, in traditional Chinese pickle jars, fermentation is an ongoing process. Fresh vegetables are constantly added, and sometimes extra salt is sprinkled directly into the brine. Tracking salt percentage or pinpointing the exact stage of fermentation over time isn't just impractical, it's nearly impossible. Meanwhile, constantly introducing new vegetables also means introducing new microbes, nutrients, and food sources for them. This ongoing cycle creates an ever-evolving microbial ecosystem, making an old pad thai jar far more diverse and resilient than a freshly started batch. In contrast, Noma's fermentation lab takes a highly controlled approach, meticulously testing variables to understand how different factors influence fermentation. Precision ensures consistency, but their process is also fundamentally different. While they do practice backslopping, the idea of preserving and reusing a jar of brine for different vegetables across a long period of time, a defining feature of Sichuan pad thai, might not be part of their standard method. Neither method is inherently better, but it's fascinating to see how such a small difference, like the salt percentage calculation, reflects different techniques, intentions, and cultural contexts. Fermentation happens with or without us. Yet choosing to actively and intentionally participate in its microbial dance feels like tapping into something bigger than just making food last longer. After getting a glimpse into the science, after tasting the results, I now approach these two jars with a newfound appreciation and reverence for the wisdom of those before us who mastered fermentation without knowing a thing about bacteria, for the culture and tradition passed on through generations, connecting us through time and space all over the world, and for the curiosity and innovation that continue to involve fermentation today.
I guess I have officially entered my pickle phase.
But what's better than a romantic revelation? Eating! And we're not done with pad thai yet. Next episode, I'll show you how to work pad thai in both Chinese classics and Western twists. Trust me, it's about to get tasty.
Oh, that veggie is good.
Yeah, we were saving it for a special occasion.
Pickle.